Wow, I mean, obviously, I always knew shit. If I'm in trouble fighting one of the, if not the greatest strikers ever in this division, I need that takedown, got the takedown. You know, at this level, it's hard to keep people down. This man is the king of getting back up. Nobody can take him down and keep him there. I got a few good ones, landed a few good punches, but ultimately, I believe this fight was won on the feet. Like I said, I'm alive right now. That's just a bonus. I came in here to die for this belt, and I came here to take a life. Luckily tonight, we didn't have to do either of those things. But here I am, and still champion, baby. Thank you, Perth. This was the most amazing atmosphere I've ever fought in front. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Everybody back home. Like my julle gaan nooit leer nie. Maar ons sal hulle maar elke keer herinner. Hulle weet nie wat ons weet nie.
In almost every era of the UFC, one fighter emerges who forces the entire MMA world to rethink what they thought they knew. For years, that fighter has been Dricus du Plessis, not because he arrived with overwhelming hype, not because he looked unbeatable, but because almost everyone underestimated him. From the moment he entered the UFC, criticism followed him everywhere. Fans questioned his striking, analysts criticized his technique, even other fighters suggested his aggressive style wouldn't survive against elite competition. To many observers, du Plessis looked awkward. His movement wasn't as polished as some of the division's best technicians. His attacks often appeared chaotic, and at times, he seemed to expend enormous amounts of energy early in fights. On paper, it didn't look sustainable, yet something unusual kept happening. He kept winning, one opponent after another, one prediction after another. Every time people expected his style to fail, it somehow produced another victory. From an analytical perspective, that's what makes du Plessis such a fascinating champion. His career challenges one of the most common assumptions in mixed martial arts, that a fighter has to look technically perfect to consistently defeat elite competition. Instead, du Plessis built success through relentless pressure, adaptability, physical toughness, and an ability to make opponents fight his fight rather than theirs. The more people doubted him, the more dangerous he became. Eventually, the criticism evolved into disbelief. How was this fighter beating top contenders? How was he climbing toward a UFC championship? And perhaps the biggest question of all, why did so many experienced fans and analysts continue underestimating him, even after he repeatedly proved them wrong? To answer that, it's necessary to go back to where his journey really began, long before the UFC ever knew his name. Long before Dricus du Plessis became a UFC champion, he was building his career far from the sport's biggest spotlight. Growing up in South Africa, du Plessis developed a background in multiple combat disciplines, including kickboxing and grappling. That diverse experience would eventually shape the unpredictable style fans know today, but at the time, very few people outside the regional MMA scene were paying attention. Unlike many future UFC stars, du Plessis didn't arrive with massive international hype or a reputation built in one of the world's most recognized promotions. Instead, he earned his opportunities the difficult way, fight by fight, win by win. From an analytical perspective, those early years were crucial. Competing in different organizations forced him to adapt to a variety of opponents and fighting styles. Rather than relying on one signature technique, he developed a well-rounded approach that emphasized pressure, durability, and constant forward movement. He wasn't trying to look flashy, he was trying to win. That mindset became one of the defining characteristics of his career. As his record improved, so did his confidence. He captured championships on the regional scene and gradually established himself as one of Africa's top MMA talents. Yet despite those accomplishments, many international fans still knew very little about him. When discussions turned to the UFC's future middleweight contenders, his name was rarely at the top of the list. That lack of attention would ultimately become an advantage, because while the spotlight focused elsewhere, du Plessis continued sharpening the same style that critics would later dismiss as awkward. By the time he signed with the UFC, he wasn't arriving as an unproven prospect. He was arriving as a champion with years of experience and a quiet belief that he could compete with anyone in the world. Soon he'd get the chance to prove it. When Dricus du Plessis made his UFC debut, he wasn't introduced as the next superstar of the middleweight division. In fact, many fans barely knew who he was. The attention was focused elsewhere. The division already had established names, rising prospects, and former champions competing competing for the spotlight. Compared to those fighters, du Plessis entered quietly, without the level of hype that often surrounds future title contenders. But inside the Octagon, the results told a different story. Fight after fight, he kept finding ways to win. His style looked unconventional. At times, it even looked messy. Critics pointed to his striking technique, questioned his cardio, and argued that his aggressive approach would eventually be exposed by elite competition. From an analytical perspective, those criticisms weren't completely unreasonable. Du Plessis didn't fight like a textbook striker. His movement could appear awkward. His attacks were unpredictable, and there were moments when he looked more fatigued than the opponents standing across from him. Yet despite all of that, he kept winning. That's what made him so difficult to evaluate. Traditional analysis often focuses on how a fighter looks, but fighting isn't judged on aesthetics. It's judged on effectiveness, and Du Plessis was remarkably effective. Every victory challenged the same narrative. People kept waiting for the moment his style would stop working. Instead, his confidence continued growing. The opponents became tougher, the expectations became higher, but the outcome stayed remarkably consistent. Another win, another upset, another reason for critics to rethink their opinions. Still, many weren't convinced. They believed the real test hadn't arrived yet, because in their minds, beating contenders was one thing. Defeating the very best middleweights in the world was something entirely different. The biggest challenges of his career were still ahead, and that's where the doubters believed his incredible run would finally come to an end. As Dricus du Plessis climbed the middleweight rankings, the criticism didn't disappear. If anything, it became louder. Each time he won, a new explanation emerged. Some said he had been lucky, others claimed his opponents simply had bad nights, and many insisted that the next elite contender would finally expose the flaws in his game. From an analytical perspective, this is where Du Plessis' career became truly fascinating. Most fighters earn respect by changing the way they fight. Du Plessis earned respect by refusing to. He continued applying relentless pressure. He mixed striking with grappling. He forced opponents into uncomfortable exchanges and turned technical fights into physical battles. Instead of fighting on their terms, he made them fight on his. And against some of the division's biggest names, that strategy kept working. Every major victory forced analysts to revisit their previous conclusions. The fighter they once described as awkward was now defeating elite competition. The contender many believed would eventually fade away was moving closer to the UFC title, yet even then the doubts remained. Many fans argued that becoming a contender wasn't the same as becoming a champion. The championship level, they believed, was different. It demanded precision, composure, and consistency against the very best in the world. To them, Du Plessis' style still looked too chaotic to survive at the top, but that's what made his journey so unique. The criticism was no longer based on what he had failed to do. It was based on what people assumed he would fail to do next, and every time those assumptions were tested, they produced the same result. Another statement victory, another prediction proven wrong. By the time the title opportunity finally arrived, one question had become impossible to ignore. Had everyone been analyzing Dricus du Plessis the wrong way from the very beginning? For most fighters, winning a UFC championship marks the end of the doubters' arguments. For Dricus du Plessis, it didn't. In many ways, it only changed the conversation. By the time he reached the top of the middleweight division, du Plessis had already defeated elite opponents and overcome predictions that said he wouldn't make it this far. Yet even after capturing UFC gold, questions remained. Some critics argued that his style still wasn't sustainable. Others claimed future challengers would eventually solve the puzzle. From an analytical perspective, that's what makes his championship reign so unusual. Most champions are praised for how cleanly they execute their game plans. Du Plessis built his reputation on making fights uncomfortable. He disrupted rhythm, he pressured relentlessly, he forced mistakes, and when opponents tried to settle into their preferred pace, he refused to let them. It wasn't always pretty, but it was consistently effective. That distinction is important because in mixed martial arts, effectiveness matters far more than appearance. A technically beautiful performance means very little if it doesn't produce victories. Du Plessis understood that. Rather than changing his style to satisfy critics, he continued refining the qualities that had brought him success from the beginning. Every title defense and every high-profile win added another layer to his legacy. The same attributes once described as weaknesses were now being recognized as strengths. His relentless pressure became a weapon. His awkward rhythm became unpredictable timing. His toughness became one of the division's greatest advantages. Slowly, the narrative began to shift. People stopped asking how he kept winning. They started asking why they had underestimated him for so long. And that may have been the biggest victory of all. Not just becoming champion, but forcing the entire MMA world to rethink what a champion is supposed to look like. By this point, one thing had become clear. Dricus du Plessis wasn't winning because his opponents were making mistakes. He was making them make mistakes. From an analytical perspective, that's the biggest misunderstanding surrounding his career. Many people focused on how his style looked. Very few focused on what it actually accomplished. Du Plessis has a unique ability to disrupt an opponent's rhythm. He constantly changes his tempo, mixes striking with takedown threats, and refuses to let fights settle into a predictable pattern. Instead of giving elite fighters the technical battle they want, he forces them into uncomfortable, high-pressure exchanges where quick decisions become much harder. That pressure creates openings. Even experienced opponents can begin reacting instead of initiating, and once that happens, Du Plessis starts controlling the fight without necessarily appearing to dominate every exchange. Another overlooked strength is his mentality. Some fighters become more cautious against elite competition. Du Plessis seems to become more confident. Whether he's facing a former champion or a rising contender, his approach rarely changes. He trusts the system that brought him to the top instead of abandoning it under pressure. That confidence has become one of his greatest weapons. It allows him to stay composed during difficult moments and continue applying pressure even when fights become chaotic. Perhaps that's why so many predictions about him have been wrong. People often analyze his style through the lens of traditional technique, but Du Plessis succeeds because he combines physicality, adaptability, durability, and relentless belief in his game plan. His style doesn't need to look perfect, it only needs to work, and after defeating some of the best middleweights in the world, it's becoming increasingly difficult to argue with the results. Looking back at Dricus du Plessis' journey, it's easy to understand why so many people underestimated him. What's harder to understand is why they kept doing it. From the beginning of his UFC career, the criticism followed the same pattern. People questioned his striking, they questioned his cardio, they questioned whether his aggressive style could survive against elite competition, and every time he answered those questions inside the octagon, new doubts replaced the old ones. From an analytical perspective, that's what makes his story so unique. It wasn't simply a rise from contender to champion. It was a constant battle against perception. Many fans judged Du Plessis based on how his style looked. The results told a completely different story. Fight after fight, he defeated top opponents who were expected to expose him. Instead, they found themselves struggling with the relentless pressure, unpredictable rhythm, and unwavering confidence that had defined his career from the very beginning. Perhaps that's the biggest lesson his journey offers. In mixed martial arts, perfection isn't always what wins championships. Adaptability does, pressure does, mental toughness does, and above all, consistency does. Du Plessis never tried to become the fighter critics wanted him to be. He became the fighter his opponents couldn't solve. Today, he stands as one of the UFC's elite middleweights, not because everyone believed in him, but because he continued proving people wrong when it mattered most. His story is a reminder that greatness doesn't always arrive in the form fans expect. Sometimes it looks unconventional, sometimes it looks chaotic, and sometimes it spends years being underestimated before the rest of the world finally recognizes what was there all along. That's why Dricus du Plessis isn't just a champion. He's proof that in MMA, the most dangerous fighter isn't always the one who looks the best. It's the one everyone keeps underestimating.